Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Researchers Seminar Series on Measuring Progress and Wellbeing. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Ute Stephan, who will discuss well-being and entrepreneurship. Before getting started, I'd just like to share a little information about our annual workshop. It's this year from the 6th to the 7th of June. And at this point, we have gone through all of our submissions, and we will be opening registrations for both speakers and attendees. It's looking like it's going to be another good year. Just check back on your email for more information. You can send us an email as well. Back to today, Ute will speak for approximately 35 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and on our YouTube channel. Now to introduce Professor Stephan. Ute is a professor of entrepreneurship at King's Business School at King's College London. She is recognized as a leading expert on the psychology of entrepreneurship, as a fellow of the International Association of Applied Psychology and a 21st Century Entrepreneurship Research Fellow. Ute researches how individuals and societies can thrive through entrepreneurship and how social entrepreneurship can help to build more inclusive societies. She regularly publishes in international leading journals, won multiple international awards for her research, and attracted over 3.7 million in funding from the European Commission, UK government institutions, research councils, and charities. Her work has been featured in the Financial Times, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, The Times, Forbes, Wired, BBC, and others. She serves as an associate editor at the Journal of Management and at Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and on the editorial boards of the Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, and Journal of Business Venturing. As you can hear, she's quite accomplished. And for us at StatTech Research, we're quite curious about her work as it perfectly integrates two of our research fields on well-being and entrepreneurship. Without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Professor Ute Stephan. Ute, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this seminar series. I'm really excited to share with you some broad overview. It might be a bit too ambitious to say that I will share everything we know about entrepreneurs' well-being, but I'll certainly endeavor to give you a broad overview. And also I want to highlight what we still need to know, because it's really a growing field with plenty of really exciting research opportunities, I think. So since this is a seminar series on well-being, I thought I'm gonna focus first of all a little bit on entrepreneurs, what that is. So there's different definition and types, and some of you might think of the high growth Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and others might think of self-employed. And broadly, both goes into this research stream because we see it as the common ground is really that it's individuals who work for their own account and risk. So they hold a lot of accountability, liability. They own the businesses they lead, so they are in control. Yeah, with ownership comes a lot of responsibility. And if you think, well, there's a lot more small-scale entrepreneurship than high growth, that's certainly true. But collectively, small matters. So small and medium-sized enterprises, which are typically entrepreneur-led, make up roughly 90% of businesses globally and provide 70% of employment worldwide. So there is something to the scale of this that I think is quite intriguing. And when you go into entrepreneurship research, that typically looked at who, why, when enters entrepreneurship, so who becomes an entrepreneur, and then looks at how companies might be thriving, how you can achieve high growth unicorn status. But kind of recently, there's been an acknowledgement that maybe we need to broaden our scope a bit and consider well-being, and that comes from various angles. One is that we're encouraged to consider more everyday entrepreneurship, so the big scale of entrepreneurs beyond the high growth unicorns. There is something to be said that we probably need to make entrepreneurship a bit more inclusive, so beyond white men starting businesses, which is the dominant type. And the OECD, for instance, talks about missing entrepreneurs and things about ethnic minorities, refugees, women. In the UK, we recently had a review how many billion more economic value would be created if we had women engage in entrepreneurship at a similar scale than men. And we know that diverse entrepreneurs tend to value different things from entrepreneurship. And one thing that entrepreneurs find important and strive for through becoming an entrepreneur is actually fulfillment and well-being. So it's more than money that we could, traditionally consider it as a reason for becoming an entrepreneur. And so well-being is important outcome of entrepreneurial activity for the individual entrepreneur to the extent that entrepreneurs delay business failure at high financial costs if they can safeguard their well-being. So it's something they're willing to pay for, so to speak. And of course, for societies, well-being is important. You are probably very aware of the ongoing discussions to create national well-being accounts. Good health and well-being is the third sustainable development goal. And looking at well-being of entrepreneurs, I think provides a nice bridge to the 8th sustainable development goal, which is how to create decent work and economic growth. And don't just take it from me, the press seems to be interested in this topic, and you see that there is different amount of nuance. So from happiness is being your own boss in the Times, very definite, to are entrepreneurs actually happier than everybody else, asking this in the Wall Street Journal. And the FT recently had a piece where there was a spotlight on the risk of burnout of entrepreneurs. And we see more and more stories coming through of entrepreneurs sharing that they had 1, maybe 2 burnouts. And they share this because they don't want others to go through that. And indeed, burnout and ill-being is really a pain point for entrepreneurs. And I've put 3 examples here of entrepreneurs who ended up creating startups around the topic of health and well-being based on their personal experience. So Arianna Huffington co-founded the Huffington Post and famously or infamously collapsed on her desk from exhaustion, broke her collarbone, and that was a kind of wake-up call for her to say, we need more sleep. And it's kind of as the first thing, what can you do to look after your health and well-being? Get sufficient sleep, and has now created a movement around that. And Future Farm and founders Taboo are both kind of set up, as you can read there, to help develop a model for healthier entrepreneurship, to make sure entrepreneurs find it legitimate to look after their health and well-being and talk about that as well. And they're both set up by entrepreneurs who went through burnouts themselves. And so what's really exciting, I think, at the moment is that it's going from the entrepreneurs to the investors. So Alderton Capital, big VC, is actually now not just providing funding, but alongside the funding, also a well-being program, because like athletes who, try and optimize their performance through everything possible, entrepreneurs, you could argue, also can optimize their performance if they take care of their own mental health and well-being, also physical health. And finally, there is, I think, an exciting global movement, the Founder Mental Health Pledge. As you can see, there's over 42 countries represented, over 700 signatories. And what they try and achieve is destigmatize mental health conversations and actually get VCs to the state that in their term sheets they're saying mental health expenses are legitimate business expenses. So please, founders, we invest in you, including in your health and well-being. So there's loads going on practically that I think is really exciting. And let me kind of take you slowly a bit into the research now. So we know World Health Organization is very clear. Health isn't just the absence of disease, it's also a state of well-being. And in entrepreneurship, I think we really need to look at well-being at least in 2 ways, at ill-being and at well-being. And so the ill-being is the side of, in terms of mental health, where you have either stress and strain, so feel anxious, out of control. We all do that occasionally. And then mental disorders is when the ill-being takes hold for longer amounts of time and impedes your daily functioning. And on the positive side, we have well-being in terms of hedonic well-being, happy and content, and eudaimonic well-being. So the idea that you can be yourself, true to yourself, your true daemon. And then that probably is actually particularly important for entrepreneurship, but already in terms of future research, not sufficiently researched yet. What's interesting about entrepreneurship is that it has so intense stressors, but also so high levels of well-being resources that it seems to be an extreme setting where you have both high potential for ill-being and high potential for well-being. So that's something called the well-being trade-off, or you could say, well, maybe there is no bright side without the dark. Now I'll try and answer this over the course of that presentation. And so just to give you a glimpse of the stresses that are very high in entrepreneurship: workload, long hours, time pressure, uncertainty, loneliness, financial worries, economic downturns, you name it. The financial stresses in particular is something that is typical for entrepreneurs' work and sets it apart from employees, right? If you're an employee for most time, even if the company isn't doing well or there is a big crisis, you're kind of sheltered through that organizational structure. There are programs, there's a bit of slack resource to keep you on board. If you're an entrepreneur and the economy crashes, you feel that immediately. And if you have employees, you worry how you're going to make payroll and feel responsible for the people who work for you. And on the upside, you have a lot of autonomy. One of the main reasons why entrepreneurs get into entrepreneurship, because they want to be in charge and have a say. Very purposeful work, because you can create your own work, so you end up with work that you enjoy. And there's a variety of challenges that all what we know from research on employees. These are all really good things for high quality work. And so I've done this a bit more systematically than with nice pictures. So I reviewed 144 empirical studies, so asking what do we actually know about entrepreneurs' well-being. And you can see, I'm not going to go into details, but you can roughly see where the research focuses in terms of antecedents or drivers of entrepreneurs' well-being. There's a lot on work characteristics. With the caveat that research, so most of this research is quantitative, and especially the research on work characteristics takes models developed for employees. So there's a long and large important research line in occupational health psychology, for instance, that knows which type of work impacts well-being or leads to stress and health problems. And quite separately from that, there's a line of research that looks at entrepreneurs' personal characteristics. So there is something to entrepreneurial personality traits, and they tend to be good for well-being. There's surprisingly little research on human capital and how that might help support entrepreneurs' well-being, so building skills and experience and so forth, and even less on values and motivations. And then, as I already said, firm and financial characteristics. So whether your business is successful, whether you have a regular income from it, that's an important resource. If there are financial problems, it's an enormous stressor. And there are studies that compare entrepreneurs to employees in the same amount of financial problems, so the same level of job insecurity hits entrepreneurs much harder than employees. And one explanation for this is that for entrepreneurs, the business is them. So there's a large part of the identity typically invested in the business, which is not to the same degree true for employees. The social characteristics is much less on the environment and how that impacts entrepreneurs' well-being. All of that obviously differs for different types of entrepreneurs. And there's a few studies on market and country context on how that impacts well-being. And there, obviously now we've had a lot more with COVID, but crisis generally terrible for entrepreneurs' well-being, as you can imagine. So considering all of this and these different stressors and resources, one question is, well, if you become an entrepreneur, would you be happier working for yourself or for somebody else? And so here we took a different review approach. We conducted a study of studies, a meta-analysis, and I think, obviously I'm biased, the answer is quite interesting. So it's essentially 40 years of research that we tried to summarize, 94 studies, up to 3.7 million individuals across 82 countries. And the answer is entrepreneurship makes you happy. So entrepreneurs have higher positive well-being compared to employees. And I've tried to indicate with the gray line, ill-being, basically, there's no difference between entrepreneurs and employees. So this seems to suggest, I talked about all these stresses. Maybe there is no trade-off after all. Maybe entrepreneurship just makes you happy. However, it does depend on a few things. And one thing is where you are an entrepreneur. So context matters quite substantially. And what we see is, remember, we had 82 countries, so we could really look at different institutional indicators. And what we saw is that well-being trade-offs are visible in what we call broadly constraining contexts. So in less developed countries with a big rule of law, with high regulatory burden, and with a more performance-driven culture. And out of those four kind of broad-based factors, the rule of law was the aspect that really was most relevant. So if you are in constraining context, you have both higher positive well-being as an entrepreneur's employees, we already heard before, but you also have higher ill-being as an entrepreneur compared to employees. And why is this? Well, consider that entrepreneurs have have to face a lot of uncertainty anyway in their work. If you are in a country setting where the rule of law is weak, your uncertainty is even greater. You're basically trying to make investments in your future by creating a business, but you're uncertain whether any of the returns will be yours, because there tends to be high levels of corruption, and the more successful you are, the more you're visible to corrupt officials, so they want a share of the pie, so to speak. Also, even if there is a court you could appeal to because a supplier or a customer doesn't pay, rather, it can take forever and it can be very costly. So by the time you get your day in court to get your money back, you might well be bankrupt already for a long time. So the weak rule of law basically adds extra stress. And I promised you at the beginning, I would say a little bit about types of entrepreneurship. So clearly a type of entrepreneurship matters. And this was most evident in the positive well-being aspect. So opportunity entrepreneurs generally have higher well-being than employees, and necessity entrepreneurs, and we used a very broad understanding here. So smaller firms, self-employed, and those that explicitly say they created a business because they don't have any other opportunity for work. If you're that type of entrepreneur, your well-being is actually lower than that of employees. So you would be better off going into employed work, if that's available, of course. So that's a bit of a broad brush. What was interesting to us in this line of research, that there was a kind of positivity bias. So we saw ill-being being much less researched than positive well-being, especially satisfaction. So 4 times as many effect sizes on positive well-being than on ill-being. And also that the two went really researched together. So it was either you went into this, it seemed like either the researchers went into this line of research saying entrepreneurs are going to be happier, or they went into this line of research and saying they're going to be more stressed and have higher ill-being. And we would argue looking at both together is really important to get a realistic picture of how and when entrepreneurs benefit from being entrepreneurs. And so this heroic bias is a bit that we often see entrepreneurs as kind of superhuman. They somehow can deal with stress much better than the rest of us. And there is a kernel of truth in that. Mike Lerman and colleagues just published a meta-analysis that suggests that entrepreneurs can deal a bit better with stress, but still stresses have a negative impact also on the well-being of entrepreneurs. And so one of the reasons why we might have this positivity bias is that people don't want to hear about all the lows and the stress that come with entrepreneurship. And that's certainly true. And that's why having conversations and research, of course, on this is really important, not to see, entrepreneurs as invincible, superhuman beings. And what's also, I think, in this quote from Elon Musk is just how much of a roller coaster entrepreneurship is, right? The great highs, when things go well, it has a really important feedback and boost to your well-being, because whatever went well, there is a good chance it's due to your competence, to your decisions. When things don't go so well, that may be because it's of things out of your control if there is a crisis, but you still have to deal with the consequences. And, you might question, we hear that from entrepreneurs who we speak to, they question, do I have really what it takes to be an entrepreneur, especially if I feel so stressed, shouldn't I just be able to handle all of this? And so this volatility is something that really, I think, is also an important future research area that we haven't really tapped into very much. If entrepreneurship is so dynamic, then actually we should also chart that in research on well-being rather than, doing one-shot studies. So more to do. And entrepreneurs are doing already a little bit about this. So there's 2 podcasts that I have here on the screen, and they're both, as you can see, entrepreneurship stripped to its vulnerable core or vulnerable. They're both done by entrepreneurs. And I think that's really an important first step to kind of engaging in this conversation, to see entrepreneurs a bit more as vulnerable human beings. And of course, entrepreneurship can also be very precarious work, including in, developed democracies. If you have a quote there from a sole trader, I work 7 days a week, you don't get a life, you don't get holidays, you don't get sickness pay. So another kind of point to say, well, we also really need to appreciate the downside, I think, that comes with entrepreneurship or can come with entrepreneurship. So I'm going to try and now summarize a bit, or hopefully make sense a bit of all the pieces I've talked about so far. So basically what we have, I think, in entrepreneurship is something I call the well-being paradox. And you have 3 ingredients broadly. You have individuals who tend to be very achievement oriented. So they want to get to the top and challenge themselves, set themselves very high goals, and are confident, relatively speaking, more so than others, because otherwise they wouldn't take the first step to become entrepreneurs. So these are important characteristics of being successful entrepreneurs. Yet at the same time, they have very demanding self-organized work that they find very meaningful. It's part of who they are, it's their identity, and they have no fixed goal. There is nobody who tells them, you've done well, you can stop now, so to speak. You can always do better. You can always gain more market share. If you have the entire market in one country, you can expand to the next country. And if you're very achievement oriented and you're searching for success, you set yourself high standards, then, that's something that you tend to do and go for. What that means is that you have a tendency to overexploit yourself. Remember, you tend to believe in your skills that you can do things, so you take on more than you can chew. And it's in the short term, it leads to success. So that actually, we have research that shows, the more you work, the more effort you put in, the more you are successful as an entrepreneur. So in the short term, that's very self-reinforcing. You're subjectively happier than others. But there is emerging research that tells us that entrepreneurs physiologically are actually more stressed. And the set of indicators called allostatic load means also that this stress makes you more vulnerable to physical and mental illness. So in the long term, what we see is with this constant stress and strain on the body, there is impaired decision-making, and illness, both mental and physical, can threaten the very survival of the business. So the good thing is there's something we can do about it collectively. Of course, the immediate solution would be tell the entrepreneurs not to have so much stress. If you try to say that to any entrepreneur, they're just going to look at you in kind of disbelief. So that's not an option. However, stress in itself isn't necessarily bad. Stress is performance enhancing, as I just said. What's really important is what you do after you've kind of put a lot of strain on your body and have all these resources mobilized. So stress helps you to mobilize resources. Historically, it helps you to run away from the danger, right? And we know that this kind of strain on the body can be released if it's managed well. And managed well means that you have to make regularly and daily some time and space for self-care to allow the body to recover from the stress. And this regularly and daily, I'm going to come back to this, is really key. And it doesn't need to be huge amounts of time, but it does take some time. And so that's for the entrepreneurs. And we know that the entrepreneurs find that really difficult to be away from their business and to do anything else. So I think there's also a call to arms for supporters, all of us who care about entrepreneurs, funders, investors, and so forth, to start by destigmatizing conversations about mental health and well-being, and then to encourage and support the entrepreneurs to engage in self-care and tell them that self-care is not selfish, rather that actually what we see in research, if you invest in recovery as an entrepreneur, And so counterintuitively, if you spend a little bit less time on your business and a bit more time on yourself, you actually benefit not just in terms of your health, but also in terms of productivity. Just to give you one example, it's a study we did where we followed entrepreneurs for 14 days, spoke to them in the morning and in the evening, and we fitted them with sleep trackers. And what we saw is that in evenings where they spent a bit more time recovering and where they slept better in the night, entrepreneurs were actually more creative the next day. And creativity is something we think of as a trait, but it was half of the amount of creativity was explained through recovery and sleep in the evening. So it's something you actually have more control over than you think. And of course, if we have happier, healthier, more productive entrepreneurs, they can sustain their businesses better and ultimately contribute to the economy by creating more and perhaps also better jobs. And just to say, we thought a bit more about the how, so it's not just sleep more, there's a bit more sophistication to this if you're interested. We developed what we call the 3R framework, respite, regimen, and reappraisal for entrepreneur stress recovery. It's based on research on entrepreneurs, but also on the broader knowledge base in occupational health, where there have been a lot of really interesting interventions. But it really is as simple as kind of embedding in your day regular breaks to give your body respite, kind of think about things, whether you can regularly spend a little bit of time in nature. So 2 hours over a week make a huge difference, or was it 2 hours over 2 weeks? Detaching from work in the evening just to do something else, develop sleep hygiene, exercise regimen, and so forth. Again, daily and regularly, even if it's just a little bit, makes a huge difference. And so it's the philosophy of small steps. We don't want to, add a lot of to-dos to entrepreneurs already busy life and to-do list, but it's about the little things and that you can make habits that make really a very big difference. So one of the things I said earlier, and I just want to give you a teaser of this, is the first, I would think we're now at the end maybe of the first wave of research on entrepreneurs' well-being and mental health, in the sense that what research so far has done is taken very well-established models and theories, often developed for employees to understand their work-related well-being, and looked at them in the context of entrepreneurs. So a lot of this research is quantitative using those models. But Björn Wiklund and I and others have argued, well, that kind of misses a bit the entrepreneurial part, right? If we're just taking what's established for employees and, what's specifically entrepreneurial then about well-being and about their work. And so one way to look at this, or just one example, we asked, is being entrepreneurial in response to a crisis good or bad for entrepreneurs' well-being? And being entrepreneurial here, I understand broadly, entrepreneurs want to do things, they're agentic, they tend to take initiative, discover new opportunities. And we looked at this in a context of our global study of entrepreneurs, over 3,000 entrepreneurs from 20 countries during COVID. And we essentially asked, is it better to act during a crisis for entrepreneurs to help safeguard their well-being, or should they not sit back and relax, but wait and see? And actually, most of the research would tell us, most of the research on crisis draws on threat rigidity theory and says that if you're threatened by a crisis because your business, you're just gone in COVID through a lockdown and your business is almost collapsing, what psychologically happens typically is that you narrow your attention and you focus more on the things you can control, and you do, you know how to do and how to do well. But entrepreneurship research, with its emphasis on agency, would say, well, actually doing something might be better than waiting the crisis out until the uncertainty has maybe dissipated. So we looked at something we call entrepreneur agility. So, entrepreneurs kind of taking a more active approach, changing their plans and looking for new opportunities. And I apologize in advance for the next slide, just focus on the middle. So what you see, so this was kind of a multi-level study. We looked at the severity of lockdowns in the countries and how that impacted the business. But the bit that's kind of relevant for the point I'm trying to make is that in a severe crisis like COVID, even adapting your plans wasn't enough to kind of safeguard your well-being or lower your stress. So we looked at different indicators of well-being. But it was kind of looking for new opportunities that really helped entrepreneurs, if you want, to thrive and kind of be well despite the crisis. Because it gave them a sense of control again, right? They are doing something, they're used to being in charge, so they're doing something and they don't just let the crisis happen to them or kind of tweak a little bit their plans, but are actively looking, how can I change my business? Is there maybe something new I can do? And these could be little things. If you think during COVID, the kind of corner shops, they started to add a lot of services and almost became community centers, right? Because they wanted to make sure that, even because they genuinely cared about the customers they had, to provide a point of contact, or kind of also saw that that helps them as a business to survive. We had community cinemas that started to be delivery services for pizzas because they had a pizza oven. And so it can be, small things to obviously bigger kind of pivots for companies that saw, okay, there's a need for PPE, protective equipment. We can actually manufacture that with the machines we have. So let's just switch the manufacturing process to something that's useful and earns us money. So that's it for now for what drives entrepreneurs' well-being. I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of entrepreneurs' well-being in the last few minutes. And broadly, what research has looked at is entrepreneurs' well-being, of course, matters to themselves. It also spills over to life partners. So I'm going to answer the question, is it good or bad to live with an entrepreneur? And we know that well-being matters for the entrepreneur's firm performance, opportunity recognition, creativity, and also persistence in entrepreneurship. So let me kind of unpack that a bit. I do want to put in a big caveat. So remember when I said there is research, there is some research. So there's almost 4 times as much research on the antecedents of entrepreneurs' well-being compared to the consequences. So 28 studies. There's a few studies more since, but not the volume that we see for research on drivers of entrepreneurs' well-being. And I should also say, out of the 28 studies, there's 10 or so that have better research design, longitudinal designs. So what do we know? So the numbers is the times it's been researched, so the numbers behind the concepts. So broadly, if you're a happy entrepreneur, you see more opportunities, you're more proactive, you put in more effort into your business, and you're less likely to stay away from your business. And because you're working harder and smarter, arguably, by seeing new opportunities, your firm is more likely to thrive. And we also see that entrepreneurs are less likely to give up, so they're more persistent in entrepreneurship when they're happy in it. And then there is a bit of research that looks also at the feedback loop. And what strikes me here is that it's, again, the perceived success that seems to matter more than whether your firm objectively is doing well. So it has probably more to do with, okay, according to the goals that I set myself for my business, am I doing well or not? And if I think I am, then that's an important source of well-being. And of course, if your firm is doing well, it also has an impact on all the kind of characteristics I talked about earlier, work, financial, and so forth, and that feedback into your well-being. And what's interesting, again, so there's a focus either on ill-being or well-being, but there's actually one study that shows us how important it is to look at both together, because if you are in a happy state, for lack of a better word, you're more likely to see the big picture, be creative, be very future-oriented and forward planning, which is great. But it's only great if you also get the things done in the here and now that need to be done. And that actually seems to be fueled more by negative affect. So it's a kind of plea to look at both ill-being and well-being, but also kind of appreciate that both can have important functions for entrepreneurs. So it's not, happiness is not the end in all.
Ute, you have just about 5 minutes left.
That's great. I can do that. Thanks. And so what we do see, there's few studies, but they all agree that basically if you are kind of the partner or the family of an entrepreneur, that can be quite a tough job, because basically if the business isn't doing well, the entrepreneur is miserable, and that spills over to their partners. There can also be positive feedback loops, but you are in it, you're kind of almost a silent partner in the business as far as well-being is concerned. There's one interesting study that shows us that if entrepreneurs are happy, they also tend to be more tolerant. And that study is interesting because it looks at entrepreneurs in post-genocide Rwanda. And you may remember the genocide came into being because of intergroup conflicts. So tolerance towards other groups, other tribes is a really important thing where actually well-being might have positive spillover effects into community outcomes that we haven't even started to look at. And vice versa, we know that stress can lead to unethical behavior, cutting corners. So if we can support entrepreneurs' well-being, then maybe, just maybe, we can also enhance more responsible and diminish destructive entrepreneurship. And then surprisingly, employees and other stakeholders have hardly been looked at. So that was 2018. And I just want to give you two examples that hopefully are memorable enough that I don't need to explain them much. But, entrepreneurs can create very toxic workplace cultures. Think of Uber and all the scandals around it, but they can also create very positive workplaces. So there's an entrepreneur in Seattle who basically took a huge income cut to be able to put everybody in his company on 70K. It was later a bit increased by 70K. That's the threshold that well-being research tells us is when you don't need to worry about the daily necessities of life any longer. And he did reference that research. Also did really interesting things during COVID. But so can be both, place for good and for maybe not so good things. So then one of the questions we've recently been interested in, that's my last study I'll walk you through, is will working in a founder-led firm make you happy as an employee? And what we found is it's very much a double-edged sword. And we looked at employee job satisfaction and general mental health in this study. And so basically there are two pathways. So if you work in a smaller founder-led firm, you have more autonomy, more say over your work as an employee. You also have more social support, and both are really important for your well-being. At the same time, because very proactive entrepreneurs, they see opportunities and then they want to quickly exploit them. And all of that means for the employees that their tasks can change quickly, and there can be a lot of time pressure because opportunities are often time sensitive. So they have a lot higher workload demands if they're employees working for very proactive entrepreneurial entrepreneurs. And all of this, if you want, gets worse in times of instability. And we've done kind of back and forth, it holds for both growth, which we often think is desirable, but also for decline in terms of employees. And times of instability, the negative effects outweigh the positive ones. So you have more demands, and these effects are stronger in times of instability. So they diminish employee well-being. So it really is a very double-edged sword working in a founder-led firm. You need to be willing to put up with a lot of work pressure. Right, I have two more slides, I think. So where to next? I've already alluded to what I'm saying in this slide, but I thought it's worth to kind of summarize it. So we know a lot about what drives entrepreneurs' well-being. We could still know more, but there's really a need also to better understand the consequences of entrepreneurs' well-being and to appreciate a bit more the entrepreneurial part, if you want, rather than applying theories that were developed for other work contexts. And so we need more kind of theorizing on the dynamic aspects, kind of considering context, also kind of appreciating that work isn't bound for entrepreneurs like it is for others. It's very fluid. They, when we speak to them, we say, can we ring you after work? That can be 9, 10 in the evening. And that this flexibility is often something they value. Need to appreciate more that, for entrepreneurs, it's not just work, it's who they are. So there's a really big identity component. I think I've made enough to plea for a more refined understanding for well-being, measuring different components, including physiological measures, and appreciate a bit more that there are trade-offs and paradoxes at play. So it's not just that entrepreneurship will make you happy, it is also very stressful. Eudaimonic well-being is really under-researched. I think the previous speaker in this seminar kind of showed us that eudaimonic well-being can be quite complex, so it's worth researching, but also spend a bit of time on what aspect of it. And overall, I think we can really increase the methodological quality, but also the diversity of methods we bring to bear on this important research area, from kind of really capturing temporal dynamics, maybe through diary research more, to kind of actually intervening to enhance entrepreneurs' well-being, because that gives us causal evidence on what are the most important drivers. I think there's more to do to account for selection effects into entrepreneurship, but also out of entrepreneurship. If we look at entrepreneurs, let's say 5 years past business creation, then maybe all the unhealthy ones, or the ones who are suffering, are no longer entrepreneurs. And kind of, to broaden our scope to really think of a bit more about stakeholders and across countries. And I do want to just give you a teaser. There is more qualitative research. So I said most of this research is quantitative, but if you start to do qualitative research, you start to see things that are maybe uniquely entrepreneurial and not so obvious, including that entrepreneurs actually may enjoy being lonely. And we think of loneliness broadly as something very negative. There's an interesting study of women entrepreneurs' well-being at the base of the pyramid. When they go through entrepreneurship training interventions, their well-being might actually decline because they have false expectations of what these interventions can do. That's really important for microfinance research, which often finds that well-being of the microfinance recipients is lower after receiving microfinance. And there's interesting research. Sorry? Hello. I'm just going to wrap up. And there is interesting research on how if you were an entrepreneur once and you cannot let go of that entrepreneurial identity, that actually can make your subsequent work life really miserable and lead to burnout there. Do I have 1 more minute, or I can? This is the last slide.
Go ahead.
One more minute. Okay. So I want to make a plea that looking at entrepreneurship also can tell us something about the future of work. Because entrepreneurship is part of the future of work. 70% of employment globally, in entrepreneurship. And we see more entrepreneurship after crisis. So, and perhaps with the, finding more meaning in your work is also something which can be done more so through creating your own work as an entrepreneur. I think if you think of entrepreneurs' work with the high personal responsibility, high uncertainty, ambiguity, all of this, that actually is a laboratory that already tells us something about the future of work, because everybody says, oh, it's going to be more uncertain, and even, you have to take on your own responsibility for your work, think of the gig economy and all of this. And so we can learn something about the bright and dark side of the future of work by looking at entrepreneurs. And then actually many entrepreneurs pilot what we think of the future of work well before it becomes the future of work. So Olio is a startup in the UK that's been going on for many years, and they worked fully remotely and flexibly well before the pandemic. And there are interesting examples like Auticon, who are actually really rethinking how you can design organizations so that there are places where people with mental health difficulties are thriving. So lots in there. And I just want to say a big thank you to all my collaborators in this line of work, because it's really not me, it's everybody who has contributed to that. And I'm very grateful for them. And I'm going to leave that slide on.
Great. Thank you very much, Ute. A lot of information there. So everyone, please, you can write in the chat or raise your virtual hands to ask questions. And I think while we wait for questions to come in, Ute, I have one for you, perhaps to get started. Sure. There are some people who don't want happiness, at least as their first life goal. They don't want to be happy, let's say. They want to be successful, especially if they're identifying with their firm. Do you think that may be the case for a lot of entrepreneurs, that well-being is not their goal, the way in which well-being researchers think of it?
I think it's an excellent question. So my empirical answer is there is a lot of heterogeneity in entrepreneurship. And it's true that for some entrepreneurs, financial goals are much more important than fulfillment or well-being. Interestingly, there's some indication that's the case for entrepreneurs whose businesses aren't going so well. And we know from wider well-being research that once, material needs are challenged, that they get upgraded, because, you do need to look after the basic the basics first, right? If you have no more firm and you have no more income, then maybe because that's threatened, you care more about the financial goals. So, but and it's also true for younger entrepreneurs in our study, younger male entrepreneurs. Make of that what you want. What we do see is that with entrepreneurs, often when we start talking about well-being and stress, if they just started out, they feel still invincible. They're still, full of confidence, rightly so. And it's more that once they've experienced setbacks, that the importance of well-being and managing stress, especially when they had stress at the moment with these poly crises, I think conversations about well-being are relatively easy to have because people feel what it means not to be well. And the longer it goes on, once you've gone through a burnout, somehow something changes and you become much more aware that this is actually an important cornerstone of being an entrepreneur. You need to be well first before you can lead a business.
Yeah, Ariana Huffington provides an example, right?
Yeah.
Cesare, feel free.
Thank you for summarizing such a huge body of research in really 30 minutes. Really interesting. Most of the studies presented were looking at entrepreneurs' well-being, so the well-being of the entrepreneurs. I'm wondering if the research investigated as well if people with a higher well-being or better reporting higher subjective well-being are more likely to engage into entrepreneurship. I'm saying this as well in light of how the literature was addressing this survival bias that you mentioned at the end as one caveat of the results.
That's a very good question. So I think, more recently, people start to kind of control morpho selection effects, or at least test them. And so interestingly, in the UK, we looked at basically it's the British Household Panel. And what we see is that actually people who have lower mental well-being, not physical well-being, but lower mental well-being, are more likely to become entrepreneurs. That may tell you something about the structure of the British economy, because I know, and I think in Germany it's the other way around. But I think it just tells us that we need to control for that. And I think we do need to understand these effects as well. I mean, there is a literature stream that says that people with mental health disorders, anything from ADHD, autism spectrum, but also depression and other disorders, are more likely to select into entrepreneurship, partly because they get discriminated against in the labor market, or they can't comply with the 9-to-5 model. And so they finally have a lot more autonomy to design work around their needs in entrepreneurship. So yeah, I think there is something interesting also to dig deeper into that. I think my reading of the literature is, even if you become an entrepreneur because you have poorer mental well-being, what we still see is that subsequently, compared to employees changing jobs, you get a boost in your well-being from being an entrepreneur. That may wear off after some time, but there is something well-being enhancing still about entrepreneurship. So there is a positive side, notwithstanding there might also be a dark side.
We have a question in the chat. It's quite similar to what I had asked, and it's: do you think entrepreneurs themselves don't give their well-being too much importance? They are always looking for something more tangible. So maybe you could say, if you were to, just to summarize what you said before, because I think it's the same question, but maybe it wasn't heard.
Yeah, I do think it's an experience issue, even if they don't do it. So I think there's a part of entrepreneurs who very deliberately take the decision to become an entrepreneur because they want to be in charge, they want to have control, they don't want to have a boss telling them maybe something they disagree with, and they see it more as, okay, I want to create something that I find meaningful and purposeful. So for them, I think entrepreneur well-being is important from the start. But there are entrepreneurs who create a business to become rich, and and many of them seem to realize further down the line, once they've made experiences of setbacks and those accumulate, perhaps, that stress limits their ability to be an entrepreneur and then become aware of well-being and interested in well-being. And I think there's also just an age effect. The older you are, the more you realize that health is important, both mental and physical. Once you've had, your encounters with illnesses, you start to upgrade that. And so well-being becomes more important.
I have another question. So I believe that most of the studies you've looked at use negative and positive affect, or they use affect measures of well-being. So is that correct? And I know some of them are using mental health, some of them are using job satisfaction. So what do you think about life satisfaction? Is that here? And then relatedly, you may know this research that finds people have low affect at work, but are also have low life satisfaction when unemployed. So I wonder if you know anything about the time use information for the entrepreneur. Are they happy at work in a positive affect way? This sort of thing.
So
Kind of two questions in there.
Yeah, I'm going to start answering the first one, and you may have to loop me back. So broadly, the indicators that are used in research comparing entrepreneurs and employees is mostly life satisfaction and work satisfaction, and you get bigger effects for work satisfaction than for life satisfaction. There are a few studies that look at satisfaction with other life domains and the interplay, and seem to find that for entrepreneurs, work satisfaction is a bigger part of their life satisfaction than for employees. I guess that makes sense with what you just said. Affect. So in the primary studies that look at entrepreneurs and their determinants of their well-being, there's a bit more of affect. But yeah, I think that you can't really, I don't know, I think we need a bit more research to figure all of this out. It seems, just like you said with unemployment, right, satisfaction measures, so cognitive well-being facets are more sensitive to map changes in life circumstances. Whereas affect-based measures tend maybe to have a bit more of a higher trait component. Having said that, in our COVID study, we saw effects on stress, on life satisfaction, but also vitality. And vitality is more kind of a physiological, you feel energized, right? So eudaimonic well-being outcome often, but it has a bit more of a positive affect energy component to it. And we saw similar effects on that as we saw for life satisfaction.
Okay.
But I think generally more attention to the nuances of these different aspects of well-being would be helpful. I agree with you.
So yeah, in a typical sample, I know it's between 5 and 10% of the total population are entrepreneurs or self-employed, and it depends from country to country. So yeah. It's kind of hard to use a general social survey or a time use survey to study entrepreneurs. Is that? Am I accurate here? So we need large sample sizes to do that?
Yes, absolutely. You need large sample sizes. And so I looked at years ago, the German General Health Survey, and we ended up with, I think, 160 something entrepreneurs. And so one thing you can do is then you use matching approaches, right, to kind of get rid of a lot of the disturbance variance by basically finding unlike employees, similar gender, similar education level, maybe similar work experience, and so forth. So there are ways around it, but yeah, researching entrepreneurs tends to be quite costly because there are much fewer of them than there are employees. Mm-hmm. And they are busier.
So we have just 5 more minutes. So if anybody else has another question, please feel free to write in the chat. So it's maybe one of the last 1 or 2 questions.
Oh, if may I have a follow-up question on this. The entrepreneurs here looks like someone who is taking the decision maker. Can be a manager. I mean, it's not really it's a legal status that may have an impact on the level of stress. So I'm thinking if something similar is observed for C managers or for policymakers, or how this is related. It's not entrepreneurship as entrepreneurship, but someone who has the responsibility or is in the position to take decision that may matter in these terms. Any insights on this?
This was a study by Peter Bohr some years back that looked actually more fine-grained and compared the entrepreneurs as in self-employed alone, self-employed with employees, to managers managing similar number of employees. And I think there were still significant differences, as you would expect, right? I mean, the managers may have to do similar jobs, but they're not similarly responsible. So the stakes are lower, even if, they don't own, they're not personally liable. What we see with a lot of entrepreneurs is that, the personal liability typically extends to the family home. So I think that's a different psychological setup in which you make decisions. But generally, in leadership research, there is also more interest in the well-being of leaders, because there used to be historically a lot more interest in how leaders rightly impact the well-being of their followers. But I think we're coming to see now more attention to the leaders, and that perhaps similar to the entrepreneurs, you're a better leader if you have higher well-being and a bit less stress.
Okay, maybe just the last question then. I would ask basically about policy, and I'm thinking about one in particular, entrepreneurship training. Have you been able to study entrepreneurship training? I don't know how often it occurs, and has it had a positive effect on outcomes of the entrepreneur, especially well-being?
So I've not actually done research on that, but I think you're spot on. That's a really interesting part of research we should think of, because there is a lot of entrepreneurship training happening, including at our universities. And we seem to be more focused on upskilling people how to create business plans and do negotiations and all of that, and pitch, which is all fantastically important, of course. But maybe if we can almost ingrain a bit of a well-being and self-care mindset at this point, we get maybe more resilient entrepreneurs that can sustain their business efforts over the long term. So I do think there is space to add well-being to the entrepreneurial training agenda.
Self-care leads to longevity of business and positive spillover effects to the community and your partner. So that would be a nice way to.
Great summary.
Yeah. Do you have any last words for us, Ute? I think we'll close after that.
Well, just thank you very much for allowing me to share mine and others' research. And I hope that, more people write that they're doing PhDs on entrepreneurial well-being. That was great to see. And if you have any questions, anybody on the call, reach out. I'm always happy to talk about entrepreneurial well-being, stress, health, all of it. And thank you so much for hosting this.